if the pyramids are not tombs, then what are they? And I know that there are so many explanations that are thrown out there that the pyramids are power plants, that they're industrial chemical factories. None of these things am I an expert in, and none of which thus far have been definitively proven. Now, these things take a long time to prove, and it may not even be in my lifetime, or maybe somewhere towards the end of my lifetime that something like this is actually proved. And I'm open to all kinds of theories. But if they're not tombs, I wonder what exactly they are. Just like in my video about the Nazca mummies, where I throw out the idea that they're a hoax, I throw out the idea that they are alien bodies, what is a third explanation that can be thrown out there? Something that other people haven't proposed yet. This is my third explanation, that myself and one, I think he was a German or French Egyptologist in the late 1800s who excavated Amenemhat III's tomb, he and I both agree that the pyramids may have been what are known as cenotaphs, which is it's not fully understood and it's hard to grasp because we're not ancient Egyptians, because we're not royal ancient Egyptians that were a part of their religious cult that had access to this sacred and esoteric religious, shamanic, spiritual knowledge that was kept off from the rest of the Egyptians and the rest of the ancient world. These are not things that we're privy to and that we're ever going to be able to understand unless we were speaking with the high priest or the pharaoh himself. But I wonder if these pyramids were not something that not only symbolically stood as a marker for the power of the pharaoh and the power of the Egyptian kingdom and empire beneath him, but if it is not a symbolic, esoteric, maybe it isn't even symbolic, maybe it is the literal burial place of the sacred and divine part of the pharaoh's soul. This is a very Egyptian thing. You would have the Ka and you would have the Ba. And like, look at a pharaoh's name, Min-Ka-Ra. It means the sacred or the vital essence of Ra. So that Ka, that is the essence of Ra in Menkaura. So he has these two essences. He has himself and he has the God living within him. And it makes sense to me, the more that I've studied Egyptian culture, that the Egyptians may have taken this so seriously, or they may have been dialed in or tuned in to something that we are just calloused to in the modern world, where it made sense that you would build this huge marker. And there's so many places we can go with this, but it makes sense to me that you would build this huge marker, this huge tomb, this place where the inner chambers were elevated above ground. Because keep in mind, the ancient Egyptians, since the beginning of time, were always burying their dead below ground. All of the pharaohs would be buried up to this point in the Old Kingdom, would be buried down in Abydos, and they'd be buried in these horizontal or diagonal vertical subterranean chambers beneath the ground. And it's only during the time of the 4th dynasty that they move north, and supposedly they start building these tombs in the north that are elevated above ground. And the idea here is that the pharaoh was now seeing himself as a god and didn't want to be buried below ground, but changed it to be buried above ground, because he is now he's not only the high priest of the god in the same way that the pharaohs were back in primordial times, he is now intertwined with the god, which means he needs to be buried above ground. But I wonder if that's not wrong. This is just my theory. I think that those pharaohs still saw themselves as the high priest, and perhaps the sacred essence of the god Ra lived within them, but yet their physical body would still need to be buried down in Abydos along all of the other kings of the Old Kingdom and the early dynastic period and the pre-dynastic period, and that the vital essence of their body would somehow, in some way that we can't comprehend, a procession would be carried out by the sacred cult of Ra, and the pharaoh's vital essence would be buried inside the pyramid. So the pyramid was never actually ever intended for the pharaoh's physical body. And that's why when you walk through the pyramids, you can tell that this is not a place where people are meant to be walking through. It's not a place for people to be entering and coming and going. And so my very long-winded idea, and the thing I wonder is if the pyramids were never actually intended for the pharaoh's physical body, but it was some other kind of burial that had to do with the cult of Ra that we just can't really understand. And the next thing I wonder about, if I'm not just crazy and the pharaohs really were physically buried in the pyramids, is why are so many of the sarcophagi in the pharaoh's pyramids so underwhelming? They're not that nice. I have been through so many of the Old Kingdom pyramids, and I have seen other Old Kingdom sarcophagi that were built for princes and princesses and other high-ranking officials who have sarcophagi that are much nicer than what the pharaoh himself has given. That are actually, you can go to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and you can see other 4th Dynasty pink Aswan or red Aswan granite sarcophagi that are inscribed with sacred glyphs going up and down, and you can see the name of who's supposed to be buried in there with these magical spells, essentially blessing them in the afterlife. And these are much nicer sarcophagi than the sarcophagus that's found in the king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid. And this is true for so many of the other pyramids as well. So why are the pharaohs given uninscribed sarcophagi inside their pyramid that are much more shoddy than people who were not nearly as wealthy as the pharaoh himself was? I mean, you have to think, the pharaoh himself was the actual living embodiment of the god Ra. He was not only wealthy, he was all-encompassing. He owned all of Egypt. But yet you have so many of these other people who have much more magnificent burial sarcophagi than the pharaoh himself had. And these sarcophagi actually had these people's names carved in them, which the pharaohs don't have in many cases. Why that is, I have never seen an adequate explanation for. And I'm up for an explanation. I've asked Egyptologists about this before, and hopefully someday I get some kind of answer. And my 5th question, which I kind of covered in question 4, is just the lack of inscriptions. There's this common misconception among people who kind of myth bust this, where they say, oh, well, you know, during this Old Kingdom time period, it wasn't really the time period in Egyptian history where they are inscribing the interior of tombs to the degree that they will later on during the New Kingdom. If you want to go see a heavily inscribed tomb that has a lot of decoration, it has the pharaoh's name all over the tomb, then you should go to the Valley of the Kings and go down into those tombs and check them out. Well, this is kind of not an explanation, because the New Kingdom is more than 1,000 years later, and it's in some ways it's a kind of a new civilization. It's a revolution, a twice removed revolution of the Old Kingdom, because you have the Old Kingdom, it collapses into the First Intermediate Period. You have the Middle Kingdom, that collapses again into the Second Intermediate Period, and then the New Kingdom begins, and that is with Ahmose the First. That's the founding of the Valley of Kings. Far, far removed. I mean, that's around 1500 BC, and the Old Kingdom collapses around 2100 BC. So this is 600 years later, twice removed. Comparing them doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially given the fact that the Great Pyramid is attributed to the early 4th dynasty, but if we go back into the 3rd and even the 2nd dynasty, going back to 2700 BC, 2800 BC, really pushing back to the earliest era, to the earliest centuries of the Egyptian world, we do find mastaba tombs that are made out of mud brick, where the interior is actually decorated and the walls are painted and there are inscriptions on the walls and there are statues in there with early dynastic glyphs. These tombs were being decorated, and yet the Great Pyramid, the greatest achievement of all of the Egyptian world architecturally, has no adornment on the interior whatsoever. This is a huge mystery to me. Now, the Valley Temple of the Great Pyramid either exists or it doesn't exist anymore. If it does, it's not accessible because it's underneath modern day Cairo. And then the Valley Temple of Khafra exists, but it's unadorned. And then the Valley Temple of Menkaure exists, but it seems to be unadorned, which makes you think that even down at the valley temples, there are no hieroglyphs. But this isn't exactly true, that even including the valley temples were not adorned. There is a valley temple that connects to the Red Pyramid. Very, very few people have ever been out there. I have never seen a YouTube video that shows details of the valley temple. But I was given permission to go down there in October. And there were a lot of large limestone and sandstone, like megalithic blocks there, nothing granite that I could see, and they were completely unadorned. There were no hieroglyphs, there was nothing there. Until I was, my second time in Egypt, I was there for the opening of the Grand Egyptian Museum. And when I went up into the section of the Old Kingdom, I went to the 4th Dynasty gallery, there were these reliefs that were put on display, and they were from the Valley Temple of Seneferu's Red Pyramid, where I had gone and visited. So sometime during the colonial period, they were cut off and removed, but it shows a procession of people bringing Seneferu gifts. And what this tells us is that the valley temples were actually adorned with hieroglyphs and decorations that are essentially, a valley temple is a temple that connects straight to the Nile, or a tributary or a canal from the Nile, and you have this causeway that goes straight up to the pyramid. So it's connected to the pyramid within the same complex. So the Red Pyramid, down the causeway to the Red Pyramid's valley temple, that's where I went. And then when I went to the Grand Egyptian Museum, I saw the reliefs and the stucco that used to be there, showing Seneferu receiving offerings from people throughout the Egyptian world, as well as around the greater world, all the way up to Lebanon. So what this shows is that these valley temples were actually being adorned with glyphs. They did definitively mention the name of the pharaoh, and yet inside the pyramid, on the same type of stone, the sandstone and the limestone, the same stone that's being used in the Valley Temple, there is nothing whatsoever depicting the pharaoh responsible for this monument. Now, that's one of two things. Either the pyramid was built by a completely different civilization and the Egyptians never had access to the interior, they never raided the interior of the pyramids to deface them or anything like that, because we see no evidence of that. So the pyramids are older than dynastic Egypt. Or the second explanation is that the pyramids are built for a completely different purpose than we even understand. Something that was removed from being built solely for the burial of the pharaoh. Maybe something more important than that.